welcome to the Delicious Legacy podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Really glad to have you here. And tell us a little bit about yourself and about your projects and your books.
I'm a part-time food historian. I have another job, a day job at Penguin Books. But when I'm not doing that, I like to cook food from the past, find old recipes, recreate them. And it's in doing that, it's in the kind of the process of recreating recipes that triggers lots of questions for me about the relationships between the people who write the recipes, the people who make them, the people who eat them. And that's a way for me to kind of uncover social history. I like bringing in, literature, art, other records of the way that we've eaten in the past. And so I've written, what have I written? I've written a book on food in Jane Austen, her life and work. So looking very much at the very late 18th, early 19th century. And then a food on Dickens and the food in his life and works. And they're quite interesting contrasts because Jane Austen talks almost not at all about food and Dickens writes about it all the time. And he's sort of 30, 40, 50 years later and writing about a very, very different social milieu. And then I've just last year published a book called Scoff, A History of Food and Class in Britain. And that looks at the way that food sort of shapes our sense of ourselves and particularly how we like to try and use food to kind of make a statement about ourselves and our sort of social status or our aspirations.
Indeed.
And how people have used food to stop other people from joining their class or have told them what's appropriate for them to eat because they are, not quite as aristocratic or as middle class as the person who's giving the instructions.
Yes. I've read your book and it was great. Really fascinating,
thank you.
Of course. And that's why, basically, I want to invite you to talk about the stuff that you've written. It's very well researched. And, the fascinating bit that I think somebody has to read your book to realize is that there's always going to be people trying to copy the higher classes. And the higher classes, they will always try and do something else and say, oh, no, they're not aristocratic. So I couldn't realize it before, but reading your book, kind of very obvious that, they will always invent something else and make it more difficult for people to join their class or the aristocracy or the higher class is always going to do something.
Yes, well, it's changed. The class kind of doing the instructions changed throughout history. Right at the beginning, well, not quite at the beginning, but if you look at Erasmus, for example, in the 1530s, he is very definitely kind of locating himself as a kind of middle-class intellectual, and he is telling the children of gentlemen how to behave. And he's talking at a time when young boys would go and live with an aristocratic patron. And in that household, they would learn everything. They would learn how to hunt and hawk. They would learn manners. They would learn how to serve their lord. And they'd learn how to kind of be a courtier and how to be courteous. All these kind of words, these very kind of French words that come from that kind of aristocratic milieu. And that's quite interesting because he's kind of identifying himself as middle class, but instructing a class that you think of, he's perceived obviously as kind of higher, wealthier, more influential. And then as the years pass, that middle class stays being the person who's doing the instruction, but they tend to kind of focus more on what the class below them should be doing. They kind of let the aristocrats get on with it. They try increasingly and join, in the Victorian times particularly, people try and increasingly join the kind of aristocrats if you're middle class, because you want their kind of patronage, you want their power and wealth and their kudos. And so they tell the people underneath them what they should be doing. So if they're agricultural workers, they tell them they should be eating brown bread, not white bread. They shouldn't be drinking tea. It's a waste of their money and they don't need it. Or, if they are sort of, middle classes, that they shouldn't be having pretensions.
I see, yeah. Great. And basically, I obviously, I want to talk a little bit about breakfast today, actually, and
Yeah, breakfast is great subject.
yeah, our relationship with it, basically. Yeah, if basic, yeah. Where do you want to start?
Well, breakfast is a good place to start. Actually, it's funny that you, because when I wrote my book, I sent it to my editor, and I think breakfast was somewhere in the middle, and he sent it back to me, and he said, "Why don't we start with breakfast?" And I went, "Oh yeah, that's quite a good idea." So my book opens with breakfast because it seems to be a very good place to start the day. But it's I mean, I don't go back. I know you're a specialist in sort of Greek and Roman and very, very early times, and I don't try and go back much beyond kind of 1066 and Anglo-Saxon Britain. But why don't we start with the Anglo-Saxons?
Yeah, let's.
And think about, because breakfast to them wasn't a very important meal, was it? It wasn't, their dinner would have been early in the day. It might have been as early as 10 a.m., not 11 a.m.,
right.
Maybe noon. And so if you had power and wealth, you weren't out in the fields in the middle of the day, you probably didn't need breakfast. You'd have waited to, have your main dinner. And also, if you were in a monastic community or in the church at all, and this goes through not just Anglo-Saxon Britain, but kind of later on, there was quite a lot of emphasis on denying yourself, on being very ascetic, not eating too many meals. And I think, King Alfred, for example, he translated the Decameron, is that right? And I think he said, he did a little gloss saying, it's much better for us just to have, for monks just to have one meal in the day. And that was the aspiration, that they would be quite, sort of self-denying. And then it's almost impossible. It's always almost impossible, isn't it, for people to kind of work out what the workers were actually eating, because nobody bothers to ask them and record it.
Indeed, yes, it's very difficult to find out.
But they're probably eating what they can when they can, and they might be eating in the fields. They might be eating, very early in the day before they go out.
Yeah. And obviously, there's going to be some differences between the classes, as you said. We all know about the lords and so on, and the kings, what they ate. But how that food changed over the years, and obviously early on, that wasn't breakfast as we know it. How started becoming that early thing that we call breakfast now? Do we have?
I think breakfast probably becomes to seem like a good idea when we get tea.
Right.
Because suddenly there's a reason, isn't there, to start your day with this magic potion that kind of gives you a bit of a kind of, a bit of a lift, a bit of a kind of injection of energy. And so obviously we know that Pepys had a cup of tea in the 1660s. That's when tea sort of starts very slowly to come into the kind of British diet. And so breakfast probably in the following century, breakfast starts to become a thing. And even as late as the 1700s, it's never a very big thing. This idea of the country house breakfast that we think of now, with huge amounts of sort of bacon and eggs and black pudding and, hams and beautiful fruit and things on the sideboard. That's a much, much later invention. And even in the 18th century, if you look at Jane Austen again, she talks about one of her characters, two of her characters in Mansfield Park, and they're going travelling, and they obviously have pork and eggs or something for breakfast because they're travelling. Yeah. But if you're not going on a journey, if you're not going out to do something, your breakfast is probably quite light. It's probably bread and cake, toast. People are very keen on toast, maybe tea, coffee, chocolate, because you're still having the main meal of your day quite early, middle of the afternoon.
That makes sense. So there were always keen toast eaters then, people.
I think, so tea and toast became a hit partnership, didn't they?
Yeah.
I think very early on, people would put the bread on their fork and hold it in front of the fire, and that's not just a breakfast thing. People would have that after dinner as well. You might have a toasted muffin and China tea after dinner, because your dinner's quite early. That might be your supper. And there's a lovely description of somebody putting, I think it's a Frenchman comes to Britain and he watches people make toast. And he says they put slice after slice on the fork, and then the butter seeps through all the pieces of toast. It kind of it melts and kind of goes through all the toast. Yes. So yeah, both tea and toast are big hits.
Great. Fantastic. So basically we have very early dinner, and then at some point we start having more and more earlier. That becomes breakfast because of the tea and so on. And then we have the full English breakfast. I mean, today we have the full English breakfast being as a quintessentially English thing, don't we?
Yes, and that happens later. So we had, say, at the end of the 18th century, you might have your dinner at kind of middle afternoon, you might have had supper, and then dinner gets later and later. And this is very much a class thing. It's because it's having a late dinner is a sort of sign of status. It's a sign that you have got lots of money to literally burn your money. You can burn the candles, you can have a kind of beautifully lit dinner.
Yes.
And so the more sort of aristocratic or the more metropolitan you are, the more sophisticated you are, the later you have your dinner. You might have it at 5 or 6 o'clock maybe in the turn of the from the 18th to the 19th century. And then obviously lunch kind of, people get hungry, don't they? So lunch emerges at around that time. A bit later, about kind of 1840s, luncheon or nuncheon or noonshine or noonings. It has lots of names at the beginning. And as all these kind of meals get kind of spread out over the day, then there becomes a bit more of a space for breakfast. And I think it becomes partly it's the big country house breakfast from which we get this idea of the full English breakfast. That comes very much in Victorian times, when people, if they had the money and the leisure, would spend days or weeks on end at each other's big country houses. And the men would go out for the day shooting or hunt, or they'd women as well if they wanted to, shooting, hunting, fishing, doing those kind of sporting pursuits. And so they'd have a big manly breakfast at the beginning of the day to kind of set them up for the day. And then maybe not that much in the middle, a picnic or pork pie or something, and then dinner in the evening. And so breakfast became this really big thing, and it became not just pragmatically a big thing because people needed to eat a lot to kind of keep them going. It became a sort of image of your power and your wealth. So if you have this great big country house sideboard, in the evening, you're going to have a French dinner or a dinner that looks French, and your chef might be French, and all the names of the dishes that you serve will be in French, whether they're French or not.
Yeah.
And so in the morning, you want to say something about your kind of Britishness. And that's where those dinners, they kind of reached across the nation. So they went to Scotland and kind of got, Scottish ideas of sort of, trout and to Wales and these kind of beautiful, and Ireland, and got these lovely ideas of kind of porridge. Queen Victoria liked porridge, Balmoral, she made that very popular. And then you'd have something from the home farm, your own cream from your own cows, or pork, ham or something from your own breed of pigs, And so you're kind of making a statement about your reach and your wealth. And you might have something like kedgeree or curried or devilled kidneys, which says something about the kind of the stretch of empire. And that's a kind of so the breakfast table becomes quite a map of kind of entitlement, really.
Yeah, so we have all these little distinct elements and flavors from the Scottish and the Irish and the Welsh and the English, and also the empire too. So,
yes, exactly.
Yeah. So all this stuff we know as breakfast, as more elaborate breakfast, like like we have a Sunday on a Sunday today nowadays.
Yes, if you're lucky. Yeah.
Also, we might have some avocado on toast and
they
eggs,
wouldn't. They would not have had avocado on toast
Yeah.
at the Edwardian country house breakfast. I think we know that.
But I'm a bit partial for some smoked salmon or some trout myself, so I don't mind.
Yeah,
that
no,
either.
it's a good choice. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Today's episode is brought to you with the welcome support of Maltby & Creek, UK's leading Greek delicatessen, supplier and distributor of premium Greek produce. Be it wine, herbs, cheeses or olive oil from all over the wild corners of Greece, and working directly with small artisan producers. Whatever you need, Maltby & Creek has you covered. You can shop online and have the exquisite goods delivered to your doorstep across the UK, or you can visit the shop at Arch 17 Apollo Business Park, Lucy Way, SE16 4ET, Bermondsey, London. Maltby & Creek, the one-stop shop for your Greek fix. And, of course, for all you dear listeners, Maltby & Creek has an amazing discount of 15% off your next purchase. So go online, go to the website and type maltbyandgreek.com/delicious and you get 15% discount at the checkout. So in a sense, basically we have the British breakfast, but with some a bit more local elements from Scotland, Wales, and so on. So a very central theme, and then little elements from each country. And do you think breakfast is still important nowadays as a meal or as a statement for the class differentiation?
Well, we've internalised that sort of country house meal, haven't we? And we now think of it as the full English breakfast. Although if you go to Ireland or Scotland or Wales, they will call it the full Irish, the full Welsh, the full Scottish, with every justification, as history shows us. And so I think we expect that to be available in cafes or hotels or restaurants. But it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because if you're a working man, if you're doing physical work, or you get up sort of 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning and do a few hours before your breakfast, you will have that meal you might have that meal every day, or you might have it, on a hard working day in a cafe.
Yeah.
And then you might have a version of that meal, but only at a weekend if you're in a slightly more leisured class, and see it as a kind of weekend treat. And we call it brunch now, and we call it other,
Indeed.
Yes, we call it brunch because we're a little bit lazier. But I think brunch is such an interesting name because it's almost as though we're saying, okay, we're going to have the same things, but we can't possibly call it breakfast because that's old-fashioned.
Yes.
We're different. We're going to reinvent it. We're going to do it different. Let's call it brunch. That's different, isn't it? And it actually isn't that different, slightly different.
We're doing the same thing that our ancestors did, and by inventing luncheon or something, or
yes, exactly.
So we're doing the same things that they did.
We have to place, we have to use some kind of linguistic marker to kind of show that we are not the same as our parents, and we're in a different social kind of world, or we're a different social class as these other people. I think brunch is partly that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I don't feel like eating in the morning, early in the morning anyway, but my work is not physical, so
exactly.
Thing.
I think we forget that. I think, I think going back, if we go back to our Anglo-Saxon and our kind of Norman agricultural workers, they would have had to have eaten, they'd have eaten what they could when they could, and they would have had the food and the calories were kind of more important than the impression that they're giving, and actually it's only if you're in something like the church, or if you're in a kind of religious institution, or if you're in a kind of in class institution like the aristocracy, that you have to start worrying about the impression that the food you eat gives about you, about whether it shows whether you're kind of spiritual or aristocratic or whatever.
And I suppose with monastic orders, the monks, they would have their meal guaranteed anyway. You would have your meal every day. You didn't have to worry where your meal is going to come. So I suppose you might actually be more inclined to say, okay, I'm going to fast the rest of the day, or I don't need breakfast, or I'll be more spiritual in that respect. You can make some rules that suit you as well. Whereas
Yes,
somebody
exactly,
in the
because
countryside,
yes, that's a very good point, actually, because they were huge. The monastic orders were actually enormously rich, huge landowners, and from very early times, they got paid in food rent or capital rent and had a very big kind of guaranteed income. So yeah, we knew that they were where their next meal was coming from. Yeah, that's a very interesting point.
yeah. I mean, I just thought that obviously with fasting, it's easier to fast in the morning when when you wake up. If you don't do any manual work, it makes life easier in a way. You go
Well,
straight
it's
to your
also a
prayers.
sign. It's a
Yeah.
sign that you're not doing manual work, and for many people that was actually really significant. That the division between manual workers and other people in society, it was incredibly important for people to show that they were not manual workers. So if you look at slightly the other end of the day, for example, the picnic wasn't really fashionable until amongst the middle classes anyway. It was a very kind of big aristocratic thing because they had huge amounts of servants and they could make a huge kind of, folderol about it. But for the middle classes, they were very anxious about picnicking because eating in the middle of the countryside might make you look as though you were an agricultural worker. And that was not a good look for them, And they need to, and it's like with breakfast, you need to show that you're not a working person, that you have the lifestyle, whether that's spiritual or to do with kind of class status.
Yeah, so fascinating.
That allows you to not eat.
So fascinating trying to copy, always trying to copy something that we perceive it's better. But we might, if you think about now, we might say, okay, brown bread is actually better for you than white bread. So maybe eating your vegetables and brown bread, it was actually better, healthier for people in general, rather than having the aristocratic meat and white bread. But no, we want to copy that, and we think
Yes,
that's better.
that's a very good point. Yes. That's a lot to do with our kind of knowledge of nutrition. But I think, the bread thing is fascinating, isn't it? We think that brown bread is healthier, but actually I think most people prefer white. I think this is one of the reasons that sourdough is so fantastically successful, because sourdough is a fantastic way of eating white bread, but actually being, for whatever, and we don't quite understand the magic of sourdough, do we? But
No.
it seems to do something to the, the fermentation process does seem to do something to the gluten that makes it somehow easier for people to eat. And it does seem to have a kind of slightly magic properties. But it means that we can all eat white bread and feel good about it, which is great from my perspective. Yes.
Definitely, fermentation is definitely a magical thing. I mean, and I think we are addicted to the fermented stuff, one way or another.
Yes.
Anything.
Yes.
But and then at some point we end up eating boring cereals for breakfast and thinking that's a good thing.
Well, yes, I think we have. Well, we all know, don't we? We have Mr. William Kellogg, to thank for that, and he was I think he was a Seventh-day Adventist,
Yes,
in
he was.
America, who started the cereal business in about 1906, I think, and he had very strong kind of moral views. He thought that having too much sort of rich food in the morning for children particularly was bad for them, and he thought that that children should deny their flesh, because otherwise they'd grow up and have do kind of sexual things, and that would be
unacceptable.
Unacceptable. You had to be stamped upon at all costs. And for some reason his solution to this was to produce the cereal. And what seems extraordinary to us is that they were sweetened cereals. So all the sugar that we wish that our kids were not eating. He found that if you sweeten your cereal and you've made something that kids would eat, would love eating, and that's become one of the problems, hasn't it? Particularly of kind of ultra processed food, who have this kind of sweet spot of sugar and tiny bit of salt and all the rest of it. So they kind of gobble up those Cocoa Pops or whatever they are, as though they can't get enough of them. And so for a long time, he he managed to do something, I think partly because he was American, partly because it had this kind of healthy idea, even though they're probably actually not that healthy. He managed to kind of get round the kind of class issues in Britain, but also very specifically because he was marketing them for children. And I think that was really interesting for us. There was a moment I talk about in my book when some young men from Belfast opened a cafe in the East End of London. They called it Serial Killer, very witty title.
Yeah.
And they had so many different cereals, and then they charged not a huge amount of money, £3.20 or something for a bowl of cereal. And it came to the attention of some sort of, kind of left-wing protesters who protested about it.
Yeah.
And the whole thing was deeply ironic because there are these kind of guys from Belfast who hadn't been wealthy enough to go to university, who started their business. Channel 4 had done an interview on them and said, is it fair for the kids in this poor area of London for you to charge £3.20 for a bowl of cereal when the kids can't afford it? And they pointed out, well, we could have just sold coffee like everybody else and nobody would have batted an eyelid.
Yeah.
But I think what they were doing was selling cereal in an area of lots of poor people. And everybody went, no, children, these starving children.
Mm-hmm.
How, that's a real problem. And people do have sort of antennae about starving children in the way they don't have about starving adults. And it's great that everybody does, about hungry children. But people are much more allergic to the idea of having hungry children in society than having hungry adults.
Yeah, true.
And so it became, a great big sort of cause célèbre at the time.
Yeah, I remember that. It was targeted to adults that they had a bit of nostalgia for their childhood, I guess. And it was
it was targeted to kind of millennials probably.
Yeah,
who just thought that it was fun.
It was fun. Yeah, it was opened near Brick Lane, where
that's right, exactly.
You cannot say that. Yeah, I mean, there's so many big businesses around, and you have the city just stone throws away. It wasn't really.
They were definitely not the worst. If you wanted to kind of target the worst offenders, you'd probably want to target a bank or a estate agent, Yeah.
As you say on your book, I mean, you can get a full English breakfast around there for 50 quid somewhere in a restaurant.
Yeah, if you're choosy about your surroundings and don't mind paying, you can probably get some magnificent breakfast somewhere. Yeah.
The £3.20 for a bowl of cereal seems actually like a good deal.
Well, yeah. I mean, I have lots of question marks about whether anybody should be eating cereal,
Well, that's for sure my point. I don't think cereal should be a breakfast food or any kind of food. They're so ubiquitous. Whenever you see something, or TV, or a program on TV, a series or a film, everybody around the breakfast table, they eat cereal, and
everybody eats cereal. Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? How it's become a thing.
Anyway, so tea. You said tea was the thing that kind of started that tradition of breakfast, but we also know the afternoon tea. What's your opinion? Which one? where tea, the drink, belongs? Does it belong to the afternoon tea or the breakfast?
Well, I grew up in Yorkshire, actually. So for me, tea belongs everywhere.
Excellent.
And tea is quite an important part of my as a rhythm of my day. And it depends on who you are. There's a very funny bit in Gilly Cooper has this very funny book on class, and she says the kind of upper middle classes drink, and the kind of aristocratic classes drink China tea for breakfast, and then they drink tea. Then they have kind of afternoon tea, and the words afternoon tea are really interesting because if you're that class, the person who has the China tea, and then you might have supper in the evening, you would never call it afternoon tea because it's something you have in the middle of the afternoon, and it's the only tea you have in the middle of the afternoon.
Of course.
Whereas if you come from Yorkshire, where I come from, or further north, or if you come from a more kind of working class background, you might have a meal in the afternoon and call it tea, but it would be the main meal. You might have it at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock. And in the past, you'd have almost certainly have had a cup of tea with that meal. And if you were very poor in the past, if you were kind of working in a lace factory in Nottingham, or if you're working a mill in Bradford or something, and your main evening meal was just some bread and some cheese and some bacon or something, if you're lucky, and a few other things, that cup of tea would have turned your cold meal into something that felt like a hot one. It was incredibly important. And I think that's why the drink gave its name to this meal in the middle of the afternoon.
I see.
And but then there's a thing we call high tea, which is a bit more classless actually in a way, because it's sort of sometimes seen as a meal for children, but it's when you have a really kind of fantastic spread. And I love a good high tea because it's got fantastic, it's got lots of different kinds of breads. It might have lots of amazing cheese and some ham. It's got parkin and cakes, apple pie, you might have all scones, and it might have all these kind of wonderful treats all together, and you can have all of them with a cup of tea, which is my idea of a really, really good meal.
I just imagining that now in front of my eyes, and I'm like, yes.
Yeah, I know. I bet you're going to go. Yeah, I bet you're going to go back and think, oh, I'm going to make a cup of tea and have some toast or something with it. So all these kind of wonderful bits of deliciousness. But you can still, if you come from the north, you might still have your tea. Like I used to have a Scottish friend, and he'd said, "Oh, I'm having fish and chips for my tea."
Yeah,
and that is your main dinner. But if you're posher, let's use the word for want of a better one, you would never use the word tea like that. So that sort of cup of tea you have in the middle of the afternoon, originally it would have been with just bread and butter. Now it might be with sandwiches, cake or something. That's just called tea because it has no... You don't need the adjective to show when it's happening.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. So Christmas is approaching, and I want to ask you if we have any traditional Christmas breakfast stuff that you know of.
I think one of the nice things about Christmas breakfast is how individual it is, actually. If you ask any family, they probably have a different one, and some people it's smoked salmon and or smoked trout and maybe prosecco and champagne if you want to start. You just
described our breakfast here in the house.
That's yours. Yes, yeah, and that's nice. I think that's, but I think that's grown up quite organically. Although, having said that, it is a sort of it does take us back, doesn't it, to that kind of country house breakfast, that kind of idea of the kind of the fruits of the land. But other people I know have things like pancakes on Christmas Day and spiced apple, or just because they can. People, you can have whatever you like, and so I don't think we've ever had traditional Christmas breakfast food in this country, but I think. Some of if you go back to the, this country house ideal, at Christmas, there would definitely be some sort of winter food. So, for example, you might have something like spiced beef on the table. And spiced beef comes from the tradition of killing your cattle at Martinmas in November, because that's when they're sleekest and fattest. And we've always had to kill our livestock just before the winter, because they were competing for us with grain over the winter, until people learned different ways of feeding them and keeping them alive over the winter that didn't compete with us. And so you'd kill your pigs, you'd kill your cattle then, and so things like really good bacon, gammon, pickled pork, which is an old way of doing a kind of a leg of pork, which is really delicious, or this amazing spiced beef, which I've got a recipe in my book, and I really recommend people do it, because it's a bit like pastrami.
Yeah, sorry.
And it's not that difficult to do. You just have to be quite patient. You have to kind of use the right kind of salt and the right kind of spices, and then just turn it in your fridge every day. And it's amazing. It's so completely delicious. And that's a really good thing to have for Christmas. I think we should be bringing that back, whether for whether for breakfast or any other part of the day.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, I might try it actually this Christmas. Yeah, sounds like a great idea.
Do let me know how you get on.
Brilliant. Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, in traditionally or in older, like 400, 500 years ago, you would have one meal, and that would be early. So your Christmas meal would be like, as you said, like 12 o'clock or something early, and that would be the one meal that you have all day, I suppose.
Yeah, and not much point of having a Christmas breakfast as well.
Yeah.
I think yes.
But even nowadays, I suppose, we do have our Christmas dinner early-ish compared to other days, right? Usually,
I think people do because it's. I think we're going back to the traditions of the 16th, 17th, 18th, early 19th century,
right?
When you have like a one big meal of the day.
Yeah.
And we forget about, you might call it Christmas lunch, you might call it Christmas dinner, but I think a lot of people eat at 2, 3 or 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, don't they?
Because we do overindulge, yeah.
And revert to the traditions of our ancestors. Yes.
So it's like, okay, we'll have one big meal on Christmas and then, you have the leftovers the next day and so on.
But that's a very, we're going back to a very kind of traditional way of eating, actually.
Yeah, that's probably one good thing, I suppose.
Yes, indeed.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode.
You're very welcome. It's very nice to talk to you. And good luck with your making, good luck with your spiced beef.
Yes, thank you. I'll definitely make it and send a photo and tag you.
Yeah, do. That'd be great. Okay.
Great. Have
a
lovely day.
Nice to talk to you.
And
you
lovely
too.
weekend. Cheers.
Okay, bye-bye. Bye.
Bye. Thank you once again for listening to the Delicious Legacy podcast. For the last few months, we've been working hard behind the scenes in order to create some food-related videos for your hungry and ravenous eyes. I'm pleased to say some progress has been made on that front. Keep your eyes and ears open. I love to hear your thoughts and responses, so please head over on Twitter and tell me what you think. You can follow the podcast at The Delicious Legacy, all one word. Or join me on Patreon, where you can put The Delicious Legacy again, one word. And that's Patreon, Patreon/The Delicious Legacy. Or Google Patreon and The Delicious Legacy podcast. This podcast can only keep going with the generous support of our subscribers on Patreon. You guys keep me running, you help me cover my costs, and allow me to dedicate more time researching each episode. I want to thank all of my subscribers for helping so far to create this series. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider going to Patreon and type The Delicious Legacy podcast and contribute something and keep this podcast running. Thanks for listening. I've been Thomas Dinas, and this is The Delicious Legacy podcast. All the best. Over and out. Bye.